inequality. I am so incredibly excited today to be joined by Jay and Sean, who are members at Fountain House. I have been connected with some of the folks at Fountain House for quite a while now. Zoe Siegel on my team has been working there and doing such tremendous work. And so I'm so delighted to have Jay and Sean here. Fountain House is such an incredible organization that I've just been completely blown away, by as I've gotten, to know the folks there more. It was founded in 1948 in, New York City, and has basically, solidified and grounded this clubhouse model for, serious mental health issues, for bringing people together, across areas to address so many health issues, issues of loneliness, and just make tremendous impacts in the community. It's also one of the most amazing spaces I think I've ever really been into in New York City. You walk into this, kind of beautiful, brownstone door that is now somehow connected to all of these other buildings in the back. And so I've had the pleasure to get to know, Jay and Sean through that experience. So I'm really glad to have you both here with me today. So maybe I can kick things off by turning it over to Jay to give a little bit of, background on Fountain House, some of your work there. I know you've been involved in so many different roles kind of in the community of Fountain House. And I think, what's so important for me and kind of why I wanted to really do this Substack Live was I think so much of these types of events and talks that you hear on Substack are with a lot of talking heads, people who think that they are experts on these issues, but the two of you have really lived, so many of these challenges, with housing insecurity, dealing with the mental health resources in New York City, and you can speak to these things in ways that I think so many other people can't. And so, Jay, if you want to, talk a little bit about your role at Fountain House and how you've seen the organization grow, that would be great.
Yeah. So about Fountain House, we are a national nonprofit organization that serves individuals living with a serious mental illness, which is abbreviated as SMI. We have 4 clubhouse locations. There's one in Manhattan. That's where Sean and I are at. There's one in the Bronx, one in Harlem, and one on the West Coast in Hollywood. So the Fountain House here in Manhattan was actually the very first clubhouse for individuals living with SMI, and the model dates back to 1948, as mentioned by Jeremy. So there was a group of patients who were released from an upstate inpatient psychiatric institution of long-term care, and they convened on the steps of the New York Public Library at Bryant Park. To put this into context, this was all happening right on the brink of the deinstitutionalization movement of the 1950s, in which people were pushing for the reintegration of individuals with mental illness back into society. And this was because psychotropic medications had, stabilized and returned these individuals to normal, which was the condition that they were in before the onset of their mental health issues. So these individuals, they're in society, but they have no social ties. They have no connections, no resources, relationships, or support systems. So their idea was to create their own social club for individuals with SNI. And if we know anything about social clubs, back in the day, they were tailored toward able-bodied individuals who lived without mental illness. So if you had a disability, a mental health condition, or if you came from a marginalized demographic group, you are often excluded or locked out. And,
Right.
It's hard when it's hard when you face exclusion from a social club. But if you take a moment to think about how much more adversarial that can be when you're excluded from society, then that's even worse. So chances are you're going to experience isolation and loneliness, which brings me to my next point. So the founding members of Fountain House, they developed this slogan called "We Are Not Alone," abbreviated as WANA. And that's also the slogan of our accreditation body and organization known as Clubhouse International. They used that exact same slogan during the Global Clubhouse Conference that was held in Florida earlier this year. So the Clubhouse model has been...
Were you able to attend the Florida conference?
Absolutely, I was.
Nice. How was it?
It was great. It was great.
Nice. Yeah.
So the Clubhouse model has been replicated in approximately... someone will correct me if I'm wrong later on, 33 or 36 U.S. states and 33 countries with an estimated total of 386 clubhouses. So we had an executive director by the name of John Beard. He was executive director from 1955 to 1982, and he had a guiding philosophy on how a clubhouse like Fountain House should be operated. So here we believe in the concept of an intentional community and integrated social setting with non-hierarchical and egalitarian relationships where the members of the clubhouse work side by side with staff and each other. So the purpose of this is to build trust and promote an atmosphere of belonging and flexibility. And the guiding philosophy has been continued by his successors, including Kenneth Dudek, Dr. Ashwin Vasan, and our current Executive Director and Chief Program Officer, Elliot Madison, and the current Chief Executive Officer, Ken Zimmerman. And because of this long-standing guiding philosophy, the clubhouse environment is inclusive and collective. And
Yeah.
when you walk into any location at Fountain House, it is difficult to differentiate or tell the difference between a clubhouse member and a staff member. What's also special about Fountain House is that the members get to take charge of their own recovery and take the initiative in achieving health and wellness. And one of the ways that we do this is through the implementation of the work order day. So the work order day involves Clubhouse members picking and choosing whatever task that they desire to complete for a specific time period. Oops. And that could include culinary, beautification, administrative, and clerical work. And some members may work in groups. They may work alone or they may collaborate with the staff. And yeah,
And
overall,
you've been a part of several of those, right? Or which are the one
absolutely.
that yeah.
So my favorite one is usually the administrative and clerical related stuff. Usually, so I'm like logging attendance into the computer on Ecovia, or I'm filling out helping the staff process applications and everything. So that's just yeah some of the administrative stuff that I do.
Yeah.
Overall, the work order day is supposed to send a message to the members that they are an important component of the clubhouse. And the clubhouse cannot run without member activity and involvement. I should add that clubhouses are intentionally understaffed so that members will feel encouraged, wanted, and needed. And at Fountain House, we focus on the strengths and the talents of the members and not limitations or labels or diagnostics. Now, in the clinical model, this things are so much different. We're not recognized as members in the clinical model. Instead, they say you're clients, and that's done to reinforce our roles as consumers and emphasize that there is a power structure and hierarchy present. So, clinical models are usually overstaffed. You have like a lot of social workers and clinicians there, and the staff typically handles all the day-to-day operations of the setting. And there's also an excessive amount of medication management, mandated participation, and coercion. So, for example, some models they may, threaten to send you home for the day or send you to the hospital for episodes of non-compliance. So these types of environments, they're not, as you could tell, they're not very encouraging because they deprive individuals of the chance to discover who they want to be or what they want to do.
Yeah, no, I think this is such an interesting part of, Fountain House is the kind of like ability to really create powerful community to join, so many of the members together in so many of these different types of activities. And you really do get that sense of, community when you walk through the door. And exactly as you said, Jay, you don't know who's, a member and who's a staff, and the ability to like work on so many of these different projects has been so interesting. And I know it's something that the New York City Mayor Zoran Mamdani has been talking about, Fountain House quite a bit, in several of his talks too, as one of these like very impressive models to address, so many of our serious mental, health issues as well as our housing issues. Um, Sean, I want to make sure that you can jump in to introduce yourself. And then I would love for you to talk a little bit about your experiences navigating some of New York City's, housing issues. I know we were talking a little bit about that, in the call right before this, as well as over the last several months. But I know you have really experienced a lot of these things firsthand that, many people are only reading about in the New York Times.
Okay, my name is Sean. I'm a member of Fountain House and Hell's Kitchen. I've been a member since 2013, which was my major long hospitalization. I actually skipped the line to get into supportive housing, basically because I was in the hospital for so long. So I was never street homeless. I never was living in a shelter. Um, and let's see, I got into housing actually basically because I was discriminated against and denied housing initially because I was gay. and I went to the Human Rights Commission, and they forced the housing provider to house me. I found Fountain House because one of my friends who was also undergoing ECT in the hospital, we would have to wait before we had the shock treatment. And so my friend and I just started forming a relationship as we were waiting for. He had been a long time Fountain House member and said, "Oh, you should go to Fountain House." So I actually found Fountain House at that time, and I was not terribly functional. I would come to Fountain House almost every day for most of the day and do very little. And that's okay at Fountain House. I mean, it's like
Right.
you work to work. Um, yeah. My experience with my first housing provider was kind of a nightmare over the course of 10 years. I was allowed to switch providers to Fountain House in May, and it's just been such a pleasure working workers. People treat you like a human being.
Yeah. So can you talk a bit about, having to navigate some of those different housing services? Because I think you know, in some ways, like, have the benefit of like being a smart legal mind, you know a bit about like how to navigate the system. You knew to advocate for yourself with 311, but also like had, challenging experiences with landlords, with molds, like, being in and out of, hospitals as well. Like, it would be great, to share a bit more about some of those, like, personal experiences that you had, because I think that's like quite illustrative of what so many, other New Yorkers are experiencing.
I mean, I'm intimately familiar with the challenges that people applying to supportive housing and living in supportive housing are because I'm a member of Shout, which is an advocacy group for people living in applying to supportive housing here in New York City. Uh, it's almost impossible to get into supportive housing. It's incredibly underfunded. So only about 20% of people who the city decides are eligible for supportive housing actually get it. And the reasons why people get rejected are often discriminatory. That they're the most popular reason that the housing providers reject potential tenants is because they're too disabled.
Mm,
And that the city actually gives housing providers kind of total leeway to decide who gets housed because there's so little housing that those beds are going to get filled. But probably a very large number of the people who are street homeless in New York City, that 4,000 people living on the subways and outside, probably a very large number of them have been approved for supportive housing and then rejected for housing by the housing providers. But of course, the city does not track this data. So we don't know
wow.
exactly the trajectory of people who are going through the system.
So when those people are rejected, what is there any reason that's given at all for those rejections, or you're just able to do it out of hand?
They do it out of hand and they don't actually even tell the person that they've been rejected.
Mm,
Shout actually legislation wending its way through the city to try to change that so that people have a way to contest a rejection. Like I was rejected because I was told that I was going to be in a shared room, and the policy of the agency was that they didn't put queer people in shared rooms because it made everyone else uncomfortable. And
wow.
I mean, that was an example of stigmatizing behavior against me on an individual level. But at the time, HUD only disallowed that kind of behavior in like 2013, 2012. That's the threshold stigma. It was perfectly okay for housing providers across the country to just deny access to housing to people who were gay.
So when you heard that afterwards, what was your reaction? Like, how did you navigate? Or did you sort of say like, well, I'm never going to be able to, get, supportive housing, because you're like, well, that part of me is not going to change. So what were your plans? Did you have plans for after that, or?
No, I'm kind of a fighter. I just got out of the hospital and was like, yeah, I'm going to nail them because I know this is illegal.
Yeah. Um, Jay, I want to turn to you for a second to talk about, some of these, like, interconnections between, social issues, namely, healthcare and housing. So I think it's, as Sean was alluding to, so many of these, challenges that I think many people face are like experience a, challenging health episode that maybe makes it difficult for you to maintain a job or to, gain an income that can help you afford your rents. Have you had certain experiences where you've seen, some of these issues, be interconnected between, healthcare and housing? And how have you seen like Fountain House start to join some of these, two issues together?
Um, I can only, I only go by what I read. I frequently read the news, and every time someone mentions building housing for homeless individuals or individuals who have a mental illness, there's always fierce public backlash. And I think part of the reason that happens is because of, like Sean said, labeling and stigma. So if you were to ask any individual why they do not want homeless or mentally ill individuals housed in their neighborhoods, the common responses that you're probably going to hear is that, well, they're too violent or they're too prone to criminal activity and may harass, rob you, or hurt you, or all they're going to do is just turn a neighborhood into a, unsafe, uh, you know. So they also they display irrational behaviors that deviate from the norm. Or if we have this type of housing, then they'll try to justify it and they say, well, if we're going to have this type of housing, we need more police patrols in this
Right.
area or something. And so the stigma and these labels tend to stem from the negative overrepresentation of mentally ill and homeless individuals in the media. And unfortunately, people also use their own personal experiences to formulate these subjective biases and prejudices about the homeless and the mentally ill. So sometimes you have these interest groups and pressure groups that try to dissuade developers and politicians from moving forward with the project. But I also think that this is kind of ironic, though, because there's currently like a housing shortage in a lot of the nation's major metropolitan areas, including New York, probably LA, probably Chicago.
Yeah.
So everyone keeps complaining about, why am I seeing so many homeless people here and there and everywhere? But at the same time, though, the one policy measure that could solve the problem is continuously block or sabotage.
Sorry, and what is that one measure?
To build more housing or
Yeah.
to make it more affordable. Right. Sorry.
Yeah, and I think that's, very much so right. And we've been hearing so much of this recently too, particularly with, the like sway of Ezra Klein's and Derek Thompson's, book on abundance and trying to build more housing. But I think one thing, and they talk so much about like regulation and cutting down on, red tape, but the stigma and sort of some of these like social factors are, I think, less, accounted for, right? That there are certain places where people do not want to build. They don't want to let, certain people into their communities. And I think those, challenges very much so persist and are really embedded in a lot of policymaking and politicians' processes. I know also that, Fountain House is working, on a new project up with the, Corporation for Supportive Housing and creating this new community-centered housing model, and had an exciting announcement about it last week, which is really trying to figure out how we can join some of these practices of this, really strong community-based model that Fountain House has, with a lot of this, supportive housing work from CSH over there, which is fantastic. But those types of partnerships don't always come into existence, right? And can sometimes overcoming those barriers to making that happen can be quite hard. On this part about like why we can't necessarily build more housing, Sean, I want to go back to you and talk a bit about NIMBYism, because I know this has been a thing that you have, been focused on quite a bit, have actually even done a bit of writing on as well. And so could you talk about how you've like seen NIMBYism show up in your work and in your life as well?
Jay was just about this. So like this whole idea that you have a community coming together to block the construction of things like supportive housing is based on stigma. It is based on the perception of dangerousness, which has been well studied. And the perception of dangerousness of people like me and Jay in the US is unbelievable. Like there's a study done by Bernice Pescalocido that basically proved that 60% of Americans considered people who met the criteria for schizophrenia as dangerous to others. And most of these people believe that any kind of legal force treatment for people like us should be available and used. And so, should it be any surprise that people in regular American communities don't want people with serious mental illness as their neighbors? So it's not just a question of housing supply.
Yeah.
Question of combating the stigma and educating people about who we are and educating people about the reality that the vast majority of people with serious mental illness are not violent. Just like the vast majority of able-bodied, non-disabled people are not violent.
Right. And it's so interesting just because of America's history, right? We've heard this same narrative for Black communities, for Hispanic communities, for immigrants, for decades, if not centuries as well, right? It has been the cause of so much, white flight to suburban areas of like, I do not want to live, next to that person. And it, divides us instead of unites us and stresses our, housing infrastructure in the process. And so I think many of these issues, Sean, exactly as you're saying, for people living with serious mental illnesses, we're seeing the same playbook roll out again, which is obviously a real catastrophe. You had, said something when we were last talking, which was that I had underlined it twice when you said it, which is that zoning is really focused on keeping people like me out of communities. I thought that that was really powerful because it, I think, reflects both the personal and the policy, right? That we have created these, systems that really negatively impact, individuals. And so I would love if you could talk about like what you meant by that when you said it and the impact you've seen on some, zoning or housing first types of considerations that have been really detrimental to supporting people living with serious mental illnesses or trying to better embed themselves in broader communities.
I mean, I would say first off that you're mentioning the fact that these are old tactics is really important. Like the sort of the method of stigmatizing people is old hat. And all that the Trump administration is doing right now is resuscitating these tools that have been used time and time again, but they're not just used to discriminate against people. They're used to banish people. And that is what is being talked about in the US right now with, what I consider to be the building of internment camps for people with SMI and SUD, substance use disorder, where people are going to be put on lock wards. And essentially, a huge number of Americans are actually just okay.
Yeah.
As long as are not living in the parks, as long as they're not encountering them on the subway, they don't care that we basically have no civil rights, that we are under constant threat of being, banished from the community. So I don't know. I mean, I think we're at a point in history where it's extremely dangerous. I find it incredibly disheartening that, what one would consider to be the progressive left or advocates for homelessness, they're basically silent on this. I mean, they're silent on the role of people with SMI and SUD in the homelessness crisis. And that people like, people housing supply events, will basically say, oh no, the root cause of homelessness is housing supply. And some of these advocacy organizations actually just erase us from their whole advocacy
Right.
work. And they may talk about structural factors. Certain things have been elevated to structural drivers of homelessness, race and gender and sexuality and disability as a whole category, not as
Right.
disability. And those of us with psychiatric disability are basically made invisible because we're kind of like the third rail of American politics right now. And that anytime you bring us up, people are going to have a visceral reaction against us. And the idea is, and also stigma is kind of contagious. So that there's a worry that people with SMI, if we acknowledge that they're a major part of the homeless problem, that people with SMI are going to contaminate more sympathetic subpopulations of homeless people, like veterans, seniors, and domestic
What do you,
violence survivors.
what do you mean by contaminate?
Well, I mean, like if you look at the history of writing about stigma, like Irving Goffman, sociologist in the 50s, wrote, the seminal book Stigma, and he talks about how able-bodied people, non-disabled people, who are well-meaning, can have their identities contaminated by the stigmatized people they're trying to help. That is sort of, the stigma is kind of sticky and can
Mm.
rub off through association. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such an important point that people living with serious mental illnesses are, often not included in these conversations on, housing and on, healthcare and the interconnections there. It's part of the reason I wanted to have this Substack Live, not only to hear from people who have, lived experience with these issues, but also to shine a light on, this category that I think is really poorly, noted in so much data in economics and policy making for so many reasons, because can be a third rail, because people don't want to acknowledge it, that so often it is easier to like turn a blind eye towards problem than actually tackling it head on. But I do think that, Fountain House does really try and address one of these things and feels like one of these, shining gems that can do some of this work and that has been trying to pioneer it for, close to 80 years now. Jay, can you talk a bit about like how you see Fountain House as being different from like some of the other models that, I think Sean is really, referencing, and I think are really the mainstream ones that we see existing, in so much of our infrastructure, not only in New York City, that really neglect people, with serious mental illnesses, that neglect these interconnections, that don't focus on loneliness, and how Fountain House has actually tried to make that a bigger priority.
Right. So, continuing where I left off on my discussion of clinical models earlier, so there's a lack of personal autonomy and independence in clinical models, and they also have this uniform and straight line definition of recovery. So, in a clinical model, the objective is to return the person to the condition that they were in before the onset of their mental health issues. But the problem with this is that there is no straight line definition of recovery. So at Fountain House, we recognize that what recovery looks like varies from one person to the next. Now, some may reach their goals faster than others, and some may take longer, and that's perfectly okay. I say all the time, we're not trying to win the Daytona 500 like Dale Earnhardt, or we're not trying to win an Olympic gold medal or anything. It's not a competition to see who can be, on top. Recovery takes time, and it should never be rushed, and it should never have penalties attached either. Because when I was in transitional housing, I remember having interactions with several other clients, and they always say, "Yo, man, my case manager always telling me if I don't achieve this by a certain time, he gonna do this, or he gonna throw me out. He gonna da, da, da." And so that approach is wrong. So there is a great distinction between the recovery approach used at the clubhouses, like Fountain House, and the clinical model. So at Fountain House, we have social practitioners, and to be clear, social practitioners and social workers, they're not exactly the same. The terms are interchangeable, but people often confuse them though. The social practitioner uses what we call a hands off or hands in the pocket approach in the recovery of the clubhouse model. They're there to help you, they offer feedback, or they provide corrections when needed through a concept known as naturalistic feedback. But they also encourage and empower the members to rise to the occasion and be the driver in their journey to recovery. So, on the other hand, social workers, especially the clinical social workers, they typically write the rules of recovery and direct you as to what should and should not be done. So their approach is more hands-on compared to that of the social practitioner. Is that
Yeah, that's helpful. And so I think, Jay, you had talked a bit about like, how you arrived at, and Sean as well, how you had arrived at Fountain House. And I think it's interesting to me about how people, kind of like find themselves there or don't. So, Sean, it would be great to hear from you about like why you think some people or more people like don't make their way to Fountain House. Like, what is kind of stopping New York City or other cities? I know it has been remodeled or redeployed in over 300 other places, and I think 30 states and 40 countries, as Jay had mentioned. But why don't more people come to Fountain House? Like why hasn't this kind of like grown further? In like why doesn't every single state have a Fountain House now? Funding aside, of course, as much as we would love to.
Okay, first thing, I'm just going to talk about New York City. So there's not a lot of fountain houses. So we can say there's hundreds of fountain houses, but like in New York State alone, there's about 700,000 people with serious mental illness.
Right.
And like 2,000 members. This is a tiny drop in the bucket. The reason we don't have more in New York City is because we're spending money on shelters and we're spending money on Rikers. We choose to take people who have serious mental illness and institutionalize them just like we did 50 years ago. Just 50 years ago, they were in mental institutions. And now they're in jails and they're in homeless shelters. And they're all more expensive than putting somebody in supportive housing like I have and having a clubhouse available, which pretty meets my needs. But I think that people, they don't understand the scale of the problem and they don't understand the perversity of how we spend public resources on services for people who need them and
Right. We
housing
are. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And I mean, basically services and housing.
And in so much of the conversation here focuses on this like continuum of care, right? And where are people getting these interventions or not, right? And so we often the three largest mental health care providers in the US are prisons. It's Rikers, it's the LA County Prison, and it's the prison in Chicago. Like, we so often do not know how to deal with people, and so we just decide that it's so much easier to put them into prison than to offer them help. And I think not only is it an injustice to individuals, but it's also really expensive, as you mentioned, right? Like, I think I had seen one, study showing that these clubhouse models save $11,000 per year per person in reduced, social costs. Things like, costs of keeping people in prisons or unemployment insurance or SNAP or things like that. Like, it can make money for communities, and yet we decide not to make those investments. And I think, to your earlier point, we don't have a sense of like how bad the scale is of these issues. And so it makes it easier to not try and do the math or the economic calculation on so many of these things.
And I think it's important to actually just trot out the numbers too. Like, my housing program costs about $28,000 a year for rental subsidy. I don't get free housing. That's a lie told by the right, that people in support of housing, I pay 30% of my income in rent. And, the average in New York State or New York, $38,000 for supportive housing. A shelter bed is about $52,000 annually, and a bed in Rikers is about order of magnitude greater than that.
Right.
And we choose to spend our money that way. And I think the reason is because of stigma, because they don't care how much money it costs to keep us sequestered away.
Are there any of these other, you mentioned one now, like these lies that, people and myths that, so many folks are just like living for free or getting supported by the government. Are there any of these other ones that you think are like myths that need to be debunked, right? That you have experienced, to say like this is just actually not how it is, but so many people believe that it, operates in this way, whether that's for, housing or dealing with landlords or navigating, kind of the resources of serious mental illnesses in New York City.
Well, I mean, I think it's everywhere. Basically starting in 2018, 19, the right-wing think tanks, Heritage Foundation, Manhattan Institute, and the Cicero Institute, basically started a coordinated campaign to delegitimize Housing First. Housing First is supportive housing that basically is housing plus services for people with disabilities who have a history of homelessness, and there's no preconditions of housing. So Jay was saying he was in transitional housing. In Housing First, you actually just skip right to the kind of independent supportive housing like I have had. I sort of got Housing First, by accident. But one of the mistaken things about Housing First is this idea that actually we've been practicing Housing First nationwide, and it has been mandated by HUD, but nobody does it. Like New York State do it. New York City never did it. New York City runs a continuum of care model, which is the staircase model, which you start in the shelter, you go to transitional housing, which is highly supervised and really intense services, ideally, and then you move to supportive housing. And what the right has done is they have successfully destroyed Housing First. Housing First is no more. And there is a set of, sort of misconceptions and lies that they've used to do that. One of them is that people get no services. Now, unfortunately, like a lot of lies, there's a kernel of truth there, because the homelessness system in the United States is not run by the government. It's run by private nonprofits. And some of those nonprofits are good, like Fountain House, and some of them are horrible, like my last nonprofit provider, who I did, by the way, basically get shut down. And there are many, many of these providers who really have no business doing this. They treat it as a business. They treat tenants as commodities, and they treat us like crap. And so there is a kernel of truth for when the right says, oh, people get put in supportive housing and then they're left to rot and die. And that is not the way the model is done. I mean, you see that model, you see that happening. But if the program is properly funded and properly run and staffed enough so that people don't have like crushing caseloads, then the model works. It's the only housing model that has been clinically proven to work. And, I don't know. I mean, you see journalists who sort of both sides it, and they kind of listen to what is coming from these figures on the right. I mean, there's like whole staffs to talk about homelessness at the Manhattan Institute and Heritage Foundation and Cicero. Cicero came up with all the anti-camping legislation. They have model legislation for all sorts of homeless things that like penalize and make the lives of people who are unhoused totally miserable and criminalize their very existence. And that's the reality we live in today. And I don't see anybody practically. I don't see mass protest about what is being done to us.
Right.
And, I think the question that needs to be asked is, why is that? Why are we letting this happen and, turning away, as you said?
So, Sean, you kind of jumped into Housing First. Jay, you spent time in transitional housing. Can you talk a bit about like what that experience was like? What was challenging about it? Like if your experiences or even the experiences of like some of your peers or friends in there matches, kind of that, like, did you find it to be an environment that was very, constraining or challenging for you? Like any, thing that you can share there would be helpful.
So the transitional housing where I was at, functioned kind of similarly to the clinical models that I was talking about. And Sean, he kind of touched up on it already. So the case manager, they're visiting you frequently. They're like calling like every 5 milliseconds, always asking you random questions like, "Well, how are you doing? Are you taking your meds?" and all the X, Y, Z stuff. So get a you can't really get a break from that. Uh, and also, well, another complaint that I have, and it's not just coming from me, it's very broad. A lot of the case managers in these transitional housing environments, they are very inept and incompetent when it comes to helping their clients apply for benefits. So, like whenever they're dealing with HRA, like clients will complain all the time that my case is closing, or this is closing because my worker didn't help me with this, or they didn't accompany me to the interview, and I said the wrong thing to the worker, and that. So, if there's one complaint I have about transitional housing, they need to hire people who know how to handle Social Security and HRA and all these other social service organizations. Because that's not fair. You cannot leave your client out there to fend for themselves when they're visiting these organizations. Because if you're facing a worker alone and you say the wrong thing, your case is closed, or you're not going to get the benefits. You'll just get denied straight up.
Did that ever happen to you, or you saw that happen to others, or?
It mostly speaking from the experiences of others for the most part.
Yeah. I think this is kind of a probably hidden point that is so challenging for so many of these resources, is like the quagmire and that you need to navigate for these things. And you hope that these social workers can do a lot of that for you, but as an individual, you often don't know what is available to you, how to do it. Like, what is that landmine wrong word that you could say that would blow up your case immediately? And training people into those roles is really time consuming. It changes all the time, right? It's really difficult. I imagine a lot of those people were not being paid a lot to do those roles too. And so, like, yeah, there's support that the people in the, like kind of supportive housing need for themselves. We're trying to help people move through, a lot of that. Um, but yeah, it's a really, challenging space that has, many of these pieces that, Sean, I think as you mentioned, they're like trying to chip away at several of these things. And when you break that chain, it kind of, disrupts a lot of this process. But I want to move us now to an area where we end for all of these calls for American inequality, which is on the path forward, right? What can be done about, so many of these concerns? Because I think it can often feel overwhelming, right? How interconnected a lot of these issues are, the scale of these challenges, not only in certain cities, but kind of across the US. So Jay, I'm going to start with you and then I'll kind of move to Sean. Can you talk about like what you see as things that can be solutions that, individuals, nonprofit, private sector organizations, or policymakers can implement, whether those are things that you've seen Fountain House, deploy already, or what we can do to start addressing, some of these issues that are plaguing communities with serious mental illnesses or trying to navigate, housing?
So I would say, consider and incorporate the lived experiences of people like myself and Sean with serious mental illness into the development and optimization of policies, programs, and services that address housing, mental health, and all social determinants of health. And I invite people, come visit one of the fountain houses, visit the Bronx, visit Harlem, visit Manhattan, visit Hollywood. You can come in. If you're an academic, you could do a qualitative study. You can interview anyone, and they'll tell you. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that was something that I didn't have as much an appreciation for, but it is also so amazing to see. And, is like how many amazing, studies Fountain House has partnered with other organizations and, academics and policymakers to have access, to the, community, to the data, to understand what works. Because for so many people, like the investments in these things, we live in a time where people want to see what works and they want to like put their money behind that. And that can be really hard, for unproven models. But, this organization has existed for a really long period of time. It has brought through thousands of different members. It has, I think, like 1,500 members now. And so the evidence is, there for the effectiveness of this. But working with other organizations, I think is quite right. Exactly as you say, Jay. Sean, anything that's on your mind for the path forward?
I mean, I have to say, the more I learn about this, the more I despair. I think that the problems are so intractable and that the bias is so deep that it's going to take it's a really heavy lift. And there are no easy answers. I think following the money and actually spending our money wisely would go a very, very long way, because and really addressing the zoning issue and prosecuting communities that break the law by keeping people with SMI out of their communities. I mean, the ADA actually mandates that, Jay and I can live in the community and be treated in the community just like anyone else. But the Justice Department and HUD, really pointedly do not prosecute communities that do this. And so I think that if we create a legal framework that sort of demands that we have the ability to live in communities. And then I think the only way to alleviate stigma is through personal contact. And so, I mean, anti-stigma campaigns, often they backfire as often as they work. So like the only solution is to put people like me and Jay into communities and have our neighbors see that we aren't dangerous. And that's a big that is a big lift. It's millions and millions of people who need to be integrated into the community. And Fountain House is really, really good at this. But Fountain House is small.
Small but mighty, and I think it's incredible to see, how, for the members who come through there, for the staff who work there, like the impact that it does make, it's palpable. But I think you're totally right that scaling this issue is not only a question of like size and funding. It also happens out like the policy level. It happens with the way that we like treat our neighbors. It happens with the like incentives for private sectors, right? We spent a lot of time talking about incarceration and where people end up and hospital, and didn't even like touch on, I think, the way that we try to medicate our way out of a lot of these issues too, and the way that we are funding often improperly so many of these challenges is not only wasted money, but we're doing a disservice to so many Americans, to so many communities, and to so many people who are kind of like suffering in the process. And it's a challenge that I agree with, like is not going to go away with any quick fixes. But I think part of my goal with even just having this conversation today is for us to help, get the word out a bit more, so that way people can like learn from you, Sean and Jay, about, the tremendous work that you were doing, how you both like had such amazing journeys and are such thoughtful, speakers on these challenges as well. And so I'm incredibly grateful for your time, for your wisdom, for your care, and to Fountain House for helping make this event happen. So thank you again so much, and I'm looking forward to staying in touch.
Great, thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Bye, Jay. Bye, Sean.